Okay, great. I think we're good to go and we are live. So, hey everyone, welcome to this amazing fireside chat from Conquest, Bits Pilani's flagship startup accelerator program. Today we are joined by uh, an extremely inspiring personality. I think both for us at the Conquest team as well as for the founders. We have Abhijit Kane, who's the co-founder and CTO at Postman. Abhijit is a proud alumnus of Bits Pilani and has started Postman way back, I think in 2014 or 15, and it's been an inspiring journey. Uh, uh, say calling it an inspiring journey would be an understatement, but Abhijit has spent the last 8-9 years sort of revolutionizing the tech and API space with Postman and has sort of brought that the startup to a unicorn status as well. We'll be using, this is the perfect opportunity for founders to sort of dive deeper into his journey as a founder and learn more about his early days as an early stage founder as well, and probably take away a lot more insights of the ecosystem there. Joining us today alongside Abhijit is Zaran from Xelpmoc. Zaran is the AVP of Startup Ventures at Xelpmoc and is currently building India's largest venture studio at Xelpmoc in Hyderabad. Zaran has also previously served as as a principal at Anthill Ventures and has spent a lot of time 0 to 1ing the venture fund there as well. So over to you, Abhijit and Zaran, to take it away.
Cheers, Akshay. Thank you. And Abhijit, it's so cool to have you and get some of your time here. So thanks for taking out the time.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Akshay, for that super flattering introduction as well. And happy to be here and, share what I can to help.
Brilliant. So Abhijit, I'll start with a personal question. I was driving into office today and I was telling my mother that, I'm going to be interviewing Abhijit and he's the founder of Postman. And she said, "What's Postman?" And then we had a 5-minute conversation that went nowhere. Right? So two questions here. One is, how do you simplify the Postman pitch and how do you articulate Postman to, let's say, a layperson? And then how has your articulation of Postman evolved since 2014 to today?
Got it. Yeah, that's I think a great question to start off with. So I think all of us have had very similar stories, similar to what you just described around, not being able to describe what we do to someone who is not in the tech software industry. I think one line of explanation that has seemed to work well is that we first start off by explaining what APIs are. They're essentially central to everything that we've been doing over the last 8+ years. And the way we describe is that APIs are essentially the way different pieces of software speak to each other, right? And given the sorts of applications that people use, right, I think we can simplify the explanation by saying that every time you do something like log into Instagram with your Facebook account, etc., right, there are so many different pieces of software speaking to each other. When you do an online payment, there's so many different pieces of software built by different companies and people across the world speaking to each other. And APIs are essentially the standards or the tools that enable that inter-software communication to happen. And APIs have been growing as a way to build software for the last 20+ years, at least APIs in the form that we understand them now. And Postman is one of the important tools that developers around the world use to conceptualize, design, develop, implement, and share their APIs with each other.
Awesome. And was that the pitch in 2014? Was that how you started off, or how was the story evolved on the pitch for the?
Got it. So actually, when Postman started off, it was not something which with as broad a vision as we have now. So Postman started off, actually, Abhinav who's our CEO, he was interning at Yahoo at the time. This was in 2011, 2012. And what he observed was that, hey, everyone is working with APIs. Everyone has this need, right? And APIs were still like a fairly new thing where people were still trying to figure out what the best workflows around APIs are. And there was this unsolved need that existed, right? You had obviously more capable CLI-based tools that were accessible, but it was not something that aided developer productivity fully. And that need was the first thing that Postman was built to solve. It was a very simple HTTP extension, so to speak. that's essentially the state of Postman for the first 1.5 years, right? There's actually this interesting Stack Overflow post that we always keep referring to, where someone asked, "Hey, how do I work with HTTP requests?" And there's an answer from Abhinav, I think May of 2012, where he's saying, "Hey, this is a Chrome web store extension that I've been working on." And that, I think, for our early years was one of the biggest sources of acquiring new users. Right. So we started off with a very simple focused use case of how do you make HTTP requests, because that is what so many developers had to do in their day-to-day work. Over time, what we realized is that this use case is something that people aligned with, and we saw organic adoption, right? And over time, when we decided to invest our work full time into this, we started seeing a lot of user signals, right? We saw that, for example, people were exporting their work, emailing it to everyone else in their team and saying, "Hey, why don't you use this Postman export in order to work with our API?" Right? And this signal was so strong that it almost compelled us to build this into the first paid offering that we had. And like this collaboration core for API developers has been, I think, the central part of everything that we have built after that. And through this developer collaboration loop, we saw layers of advocacy that automatically happened, right? People wanted to share APIs with Postman within their team. They wanted to share it within their org. They wanted to share it to potential API consumers outside their org. And all of those have been workflows that we've been able to identify and to a large extent solve for. But I think, to go back to your original question on how the Postman pitch has changed. So what we quickly saw was that the making of a request is just one part of the broader API development lifecycle that exists, right? You have these other stages, from API design to documentation to implementation and so on. And across all of those use cases, what we observed was that the ecosystem of tools was highly fragmented, right? It was difficult to use all those tools because there was no single standard, right? So it was difficult to promote interplay across those various tools that existed. And that's essentially the first broader use case that we started out to solve. I think one useful analogy would be that if you look at a IDE for code, right? So IDE is an integrated development environment where you don't just author your code, but you also do your QA work. You also integrate with your repository where your source code is stored. You also have so many other functionalities that your IDE can extend into, right? So it's like a source of truth or a one-stop shop for all your code-related work. And that sort of framing is what we wanted to build for APIs. So for a while, I think between 2015 and 2017, we had this framing where we called Postman the API development environment, right? Where we offer all the tools for an end-to-end API workflow. 2018 is when we formally started our enterprise-facing sales. And I think one thing that worked for us is that because Postman had a large product feature set that worked for free users or worked for small teams, even when we went into enterprises, we often found that there was a large section of users that was already using us. And we essentially had to go to the VP of engineering or the CTO and say, "Hey, we have 200 users in your org already using Postman. And these are the advantages that you can get if you sort of upgrade to our enterprise plan," right? And what we saw was that enterprises, when you have the conversation with the head of an enterprise, most of the conversations around features, etc., have already happened, right? Developers have already made their choices to what tool they want to use for what. And the crux of the conversation at the enterprise scale is, what can Postman offer in terms of control, security, observability of this huge internal API landscape that I, as the head of engineering, have to organize? That's when we arrived at this slightly broader framing called an API platform, right? Where it is not just a tool for a single team who's building one single API, but it's also something that a larger unit, whether it's a startup, or SMB, or an enterprise, can use to organize and smoothen out their internal API development workflow, right? Because now you're not talking about a single API, you're talking about a whole interconnected graph of APIs interfacing with some APIs from the outside, right? So that's a very different problem statement to solving for a single API. And that's essentially one big part of the problem statement that we've been focused on for the last 3+ years.
That's brilliant, and I hope a bunch of the founders here are taking heart from the vision and hopefully additionally TAM expansion, and that hopefully applies to them as well. But Abhinav, I want to wind the clock back to that Substack post that you talked about and setting the right context here, because I'm sure a lot of the founders on this call and the people that are watching the live stream are out there looking for a rock star, right? And Abhinav came to you and he pitched. You guys were already friends, but he needed that rock star, and that's how he got you. So I want to know, what did he do that worked? What part of his pitch to bring you on board sort of resonated with you, and what can you share with the founders here so that they can take this away as well?
Got it. So I first met Abhinav in my PS1. So if anyone here is from BITS, PS1 is this 2-month internship that we had at the end of our second year, which is why I often say, PS1, it was the most important course for me during my entire undergrad. So this was in 2010 when Abhinav was working at his previous startup, and this was not a call that I made with, I think, too much thought. I knew that they were working on something related to web development, etc. It was close to home, etc. So I think I had a very simple set of factors that led me to choose BITS 360 as my PS1 station. But during those 2 months there, I worked with Abhinav. I enjoyed speaking with him. I enjoyed the way he worked, and I think even though the pitch for BITS 360 was something different to, obviously it was extremely different to what we are working on now, I think his ability to create a short-term vision and a compelling long-term story, his ability to figure out what is the set of ambitious problems that we can solve, I think those things really resonated as well. Which is why when he reached out back in 2014, so I was working at Walmart Labs in India. At the time, I was, I think, 8 months into my role, and Abhinav reached out to me saying, "Hey, this is what I'm doing." And by this time, Postman was already getting some usage, right? So I was aware about it. A few of my friends were using Postman as well, and it seemed to be a really opportune moment. APIs were growing. Almost everyone I spoke to who was in the software development role was doing something or the other around APIs. And a lot of their work and pain points seemed to emanate from the fact that there was a lack of quality API tooling, right? The sort of tooling ecosystem that exists around code, where it's been evolving for the last 20, 30 years, that sort of environment for APIs was absent. So it seemed like a really opportune moment. To add to that, I think he also had a very compelling long-term story about how Postman can grow, because what's often required is that, okay, you have a very short-term set of concrete, well-defined problems to solve, but then as you start asking, what are we going to do in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years from now, those answers necessarily start to become vaguer and vaguer, right? But in spite of that, I think there was a very ambitious story around how APIs can grow and how we can help that growth. And I think that was one thing that really helped as well. Yeah, and I think if I were to think back, I did want to work in a startup at some point. And my takeaway from this entire conversation with Abhinav was that if you're working with a team that you enjoy working with, if there's a problem statement that seems appealing, there is no better opportunity that you can wait for, right? So I think, yeah, the combination of all those factors helped seal the deal, so to speak.
Keep pitching is what I think all the other
Absolutely
are going to have to take from this. Now, Abhijit, this is one thing that, from my understanding of the early days of Postman, took place that I think is so critical and important. And that is that the entire time, I believe, while the product was being built out, you were consistently engaging with the community and consistently talking to them and refining and shaping the product, validating the problem, validating the solution. So can you just give us a little bit of insight and give us a little bit of advice on how to do that? And then as Postman grew, how do you hand off and when do you hand this opportunity or this task away from the founder and into the hands of an employee? And how did that impact Postman?
Got it. Yeah. So I think one of the reasons that we felt from the first day itself that engaging and validating with users was important is that the entire Postman product was born out of a need that we felt, right? And what happens is that you can speak to you and your own team or a small cohort of potential users, and you can identify a very narrow problem statement to start solving. But then what we saw was that, especially in the development world, right? One, the pace of evolution is so fast, and two, the breadth of technology that people are working with is so vast, right? That if you don't engage with a wider set from your potential user base, you are going to be losing out on a lot of potential with respect to what you're able to achieve, right? I mean, we were working with a very small problem space. We had a certain sort of APIs that we were dealing with, and we could not engage with users and solve for that very small use case. But then, in order to have any sort of global adoption, that mindset had to be completely revisited. I think one thing that worked well is that from our early days itself, we were speaking to people who were eager to speak to us, right? We had like 150K, 200K users when we started, but from that set, there were, I think, some users who were interested in what we were doing. They were working in different capacities at different orgs all across the world. And I think engaging with that small set of users helped. So we could, instead focus our efforts on working with them to figure out what we had to build, what was working, what was not working, instead of, figuring out how to do outreach, right? Because we had a small set of users who were excited about Postman, excited about APIs as a whole, and more than eager to organically speak with us. So I think identifying those user champions in your existing user community can be really helpful, because what often ends up happening is that these people that you identify are not just the ones who are eager to speak to you, they are also going to be external advocates for you, right? And I think that worked pretty well for us, right? A lot of our early adoption came because Postman was talked about in blogs of slightly more influential people in the API space, right? We had people from, I think, Microsoft, Google, Ford. There were developers or managers of small development teams, but if they put out a blog post saying, hey, this is how Postman has helped me, and this is how Postman's roadmap aligns with the sorts of problems that I'm seeing now, that helped build a lot of value, right? If you, as a developer who has never heard of Postman before, sees sort of Postman advertising on one side, and on the other side you have a developer working in an enterprise org who's talking about how this product was adopted and how it's growing with their pain points, the second way is going to have a lot more, is going to be responsible for a lot more user adoption, right? And I think constantly driving that flywheel of figuring out who our influential users are, who our excited users are, whom we can speak to both help them in their existing role as well as gain very valuable feedback about what to build, right? I think that was that would be how I would describe our early days of user engagement. And as we grew, right, as we grew from a purely free product to launching our paid collaboration offering, this pattern changed a bit. There was this sort of large organic demand that we saw where people were creating sharing loops, and we said, okay, this is something that we have to build in. And I think one framing that worked for us here was that APIs are inherently meant to be shared, right? Like if you're a single person or a single team, an API isn't going to help much, right? You have to share your API between a producer and a consumer for that value to be seen. And this required us to speak to many more sorts of users, because now you aren't talking about developers working with APIs, but you're talking about developers interacting with each other, right? And one thing that we often say internally is that APIs are as much about the way people interact and teams interact as it is about how the core technology works. And that required us to speak to startups to see how API collaboration worked there, speak to enterprises how API collaboration worked there. And I think those interactions are what sort of powered us through our second stage of growth, right? And one of the things we are looking at now is expanding Postman beyond HTTP, so to speak. I think it was a smart decision for us when we started, because it was the sort of API that was used by the most number of users, and it was the single most valuable problem statement for us to attack. But as we have grown, we have seen increasing demand from people who use alternate means of interacting with software, right? So there are these alternate protocols that exist, whether it's WebSockets or gRPC, for example. And collaboration amongst teams works slightly differently for each of these things, right? Something small in the underlying protocol can drastically alter the way teams work with each other. And I think one of the processes that we are seeing now happen internally is that we need to an extent, relearn how this inter and intra-team collaboration happens as the underlying technology capabilities change, right? So it's still not a process that's complete. I don't think that's something that will ever be truly complete, because for everything new we do, Postman's capabilities would have changed, the industry would have changed, and we need to constantly re-engage with our users, our vocal users, to see how well we are building is aligning with what's actually happening out there for them.
That's super interesting. I want to pull on that thread where you talked about, you focused on the most valuable problem. Your niche was in HTTPS, and then you're slowly expanding that.
Yep.
A gripe a lot of founders have when they're doing this exact journey, right? When they're talking to their talking to their customers, talking to their champions, 100 people are giving saw problems, right? Abhijit, give me best. Abhijit, I want mobile. Abhijit, I want WebSockets. So in the early days, I'm especially curious when you're very resource constrained. What was the mental model? How did you guys ensure you were focusing on what you could, and how did you filter?
Yeah, I honestly don't have a great answer there. I mean, I think what you're saying is absolutely true, right? That developers are a very vocal and demanding set of users to have, right? I think one thing that has happened in the industry is there's been a huge proliferation of tools, both closed source and open source, which means that there is this expectation, right, that everything has to be collaboration first, everything has to be API driven, everything has to be available cross-platform, right? So all of these expectations exist now, and I think that trend has been increasing for the last 15, 20 years. But it was even true when we started, right? We had users asking for things that we knew we could not immediately start working on. And I think what we realized after a few months of doing this was that if you are building a startup, there is almost always going to be something that you have to believe without being, without it being completely bought into by your entire user base, right? There has to be some difference in thought that you have. And if you sort of think that you're working on a truly valuable problem statement that has short-term and long-term potential, it's okay to blindly focus on that when you have to, right? So I think one thing that we joke about internally is that on our issue tracker, there are still issues that have been open for like 7-8 years, asking for feature X, feature Y, which we know are super valuable features to build, right? Like it's a valuable problem statement. We know it's been validated repeatedly. A lot of our users would see improved workflows if we build that. But if we are able to reason that, hey, something else that we are doing is equally or more valuable, I think at some points that can be a useful compromise to make. As engineers, it's still not something that is it's still not something that happens organically, right? If you see a developer, even one user out of the hundreds of thousands of users you have reporting an issue or asking for a feature, like a lot of your instinct wants to just go and solve that one thing, right? But you'll see that as you scale, that quickly becomes non-scalable, and you need to develop some some way to say that, okay, this is a valuable problem statement, but here's what we are focused on. And as you scale, I think what becomes equally important is how do you distill that vision into goals for individual teams, where even if there are some feature requests that you aren't able to solve, everyone still knows and believes that they're doing truly valuable work.
Amazing. I think this is going to help inform big parts of the next question. See, in the history book of Indian startup land, I think a few chapters are denoted to Postman's product market fit for sure, right? So what would be really cool is if you walked us through that. So 2014, we began, 2018, we switched on the enterprise tabs. A lot of amazing things happened in the middle. First is, how did you guys know that you'd hit it? What is this magical product market fit? And once you did, how did you ensure that, was it a calibrated approach? You knew this would happen, or was it something you guys figured out along the way? Just give us a bit of sense over there.
Got it. So I think one of the things that we started off with is that when we were building, which was essentially the first 1.5 years, right, prior to our paid product being launched, we were also doing a lot of reading, right, on what startups are, on what the philosophies that you should follow are, what PMF is. I hadn't even heard of the acronym then. I was like, what is PMF? But I think one thing that signaled to us that there was some organic adoption that was happening, and some parts of the Postman offering were on autopilot, was when this developer sharing loop happened, right? When we saw that, hey, people are taking their Postman collections and exporting them, right? A lot of what we read seemed to indicate that that was the signal that there is growth of Postman happening without you having to build more, right? So we were able to identify this loop where API producers are on one side and consumers are on the other side. And if you can build something that provides value in the producer to consumer workflow and the consumer to API producer workflow, and that loop sort of starts happening on its own, it would mean that we can focus on exponential things to build, on exponential workflows, rather than figuring out, hey, what one thing do we need to add to enable one set of users, right? So I think when that started happening organically, it was one of the strongest signals that we have had, that this API collaboration thought has to be the core of everything we do. And we had this concept internally called the API flywheel, right? Which is something where the more you add into it, the faster it spins, right? And a lot of the things that we have built over the years feed very clearly into that flywheel, right? How do you help developers share their APIs, right? How do you help people within an enterprise organize their APIs for either internal sharing or external sharing? How do you enable consumers sift through the vast amounts of APIs that exist out there? How do you help them to identify which APIs are high quality, which APIs are not? How do you help them integrate those APIs into their own workflows, right? So all of these are essentially distinct steps on that API flywheel. And I think one of the very clear frameworks that we adopted after seeing that initial bit of PMF was that the more we can add onto this flywheel, the faster it will spin, the faster organic adoption of Postman and its proliferation will happen. And I think that core philosophy has worked for us really well. But I would also add that PMF is again not a one-time thing, right? I mean, as you expand, there are always new features that you build, there are new product lines that you build, there are newer user personas that you try to solve for. And I think in hindsight, what we have often seen is that not everything we build will be a wild success, right? Not everything we build will be very clearly aligned to that one thing that is, that is happening organically. And I think you need to find what your PMF inflection point is for every distinct type of problem you are looking to solve, right? As I said, we've often had things that did not work the way we intended to, and I would say those parts or those explorations that we have done have not yet reached PMF the way our core collaboration platform has, right? I mean, in essence, if you see that there is a proliferation of your product happening within the user communities that you set out to solve for, if you see that happening organically, if you see that without artificial demand gen efforts, etc., people are looking to come to your product because of what they've heard. I think those are strong signals that you are moving in the right direction. And I think everything that I'm saying may be more specific to the developer tool space, but I'm sure you can draw similar analogies for other types of businesses as well.
It's super interesting. And what I'm taking away from this, and I'm sure the other founders are as well, is knowing what data to collect and analyze to find the right signal, apart from just a top line. Because if you were just looking at developers onboarded, you would have probably missed a trick or two.
Yep.
So I think that is something that applies to all of us, no matter what industry we're in and what signals, what data lead to what signals. 2024 will be 10 years of Postman. It's been quite the ride. You will have had multiple inflection points across this journey. Could you just talk to us about a couple of them, good, bad, and how the team sort of worked it through?
Sure, that's a stark realization there. Yeah, it's been a long time. I think one thing that happens is that as you reach certain milestones, when you have the opportunity to look back and see how much you've grown, if you were to compare where the product was 9 years ago, 4 years ago, and now, there's always this sense of amazement that you have. I mean, even though you've been there for the entire journey, it's still surprising to see how much growth you've had, etc. Right? And I think those are the observations that help. But yeah, in terms of inflection points, I think one big answer would be related to the growth of the team itself, right? Growing from a team of 3 to I think 680 now, you'll necessarily go through multiple scaling related inflection points, right? I think one example that we often quote is that when we were just the 3 of us, we were working out of a single room. Even going from that one room to working out of multiple rooms on one floor, right? It forcibly changed the way that our communication happened, right? We had to think of what our design team would be, what our engineering team would be, what our analytics team would be. Just because there was this slight difficulty in communicating compared to what we had seen earlier, right? Then we hired, our first set of remote engineers in the US, right? So this was when we had around 15, 20 folks in India. And we had, two users in the US who were, really interested in what we were doing. They wanted to build with us. And what we saw there was that, in the environment we were in, where a lot of our know-how was undocumented, a lot of it was only things that you could, imbibe by being physically there in the same space. In that sort of environment, working with engineers halfway across the world was a completely new thing for us, right? Especially when you hire senior engineers, there's some expectation that everyone will have based on wherever they were working in earlier. And enabling this first remote team of ours to be successful was, I think, one important scaling milestone that we had to go through. The last 3 to 4 years have been, I think, very different, not just for us, but for every organization out there, going from a fully in-person type of environment to a fully remote environment, to now, figuring out how the hybrid approach can work, all in the same time that you have grown from, I think, 200 to 600 plus, right? That is still not something we've fully figured out. I think all companies in the software space are trying to figure out how to make remote/hybrid work. What's the most effective way to scale now that the entire world has gone through 3 years of working from home? And I think this is obviously going to have a huge impact on how companies grow in the future. We've obviously had to grow a lot and face inflection points on the engineering scale as well. We now have teams of over 1,000 users trying to share APIs with each other, which was a problem statement we never had to face in our earlier days. Now we have millions of Postman collections that are stored. We have over 25 million users, and a lot of our systems have had to scale with that growth, right? And the way I think about it is that this is a good set of problems for engineers to work on. These are not problems where you can implement off-the-shelf solutions, but you have to approach these with an understanding of the unique constraints that you have, right? So yeah, I think the team scaling through multiple orders of magnitude, engineering systems having to scale, working through the COVID transition. I think all of these have been inflection points for us that have in some way changed the way we operate. And these inflection points are always going to be there, right? I mean, we'll see some geopolitical situation affecting how we have to operate, some economic situation affecting how we have to operate, and my hope is that through all of these, there are important learnings that we as an org can take away in order to be more effective and efficient further down the line.
Oh, that's awesome. Now, Abhijit, I'm a founder. I'm coming to this this talk. I Google Postman, and it's easy to get super intimidated, right? What we see in the media is extension launch hua, PMF media, billions of dollars of funding ho gaya and super scale. I don't think it's been. I'm assuming it hasn't been that easy. So maybe two things here that we would love to hear from you. One is, I'm sure even you had to hustle and do some jugaad at some point. So what's your hustle story? And second is, just walk us through like a struggle or a challenge you guys had and how you fixed it, just so that we all know that we're not alone here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what you said is absolutely true, right? Like it's a very small set of things that get talked about externally. And one thing that we always repeat internally is that day to day you hardly see things change, right? Like you're working on the same feature yesterday as you were working on the day before that. You're seeing the same sort of sales numbers, growth, etc. But then after a few years, if you look back and see what that growth has compounded into, it's a stark difference, right? And it's something that we try to celebrate internally often. I think with regard to hustle stories, I think one important one would be in our first year, right? When we said that, okay, Postman is doing well as this free extension. And after speaking to our key users, stakeholders, investors as well, talking about that collaboration loop that we saw organically happening, I think we were able to go from not having any sharing capabilities at all to a state where we had built out our billing systems, our team management solutions, as it were, the core sharing capabilities. We had to figure out how to identify which of our existing 500 600k users would be interested. So there was this completely different beta program that we launched, and yeah, I mean, we were able to do all of that in, I think, in a 4 to 5 week span. Obviously it involved a lot of work from everyone involved, but I think that one thing that we did in hindsight has been responsible for a lot of the growth that we've had. Right? Like if we had not put in as much effort into that particular segment, our entire growth trajectory would have been fundamentally different. So basically, the one advice that maybe I can extract from this is that it's important to identify the problem statements that you think are going to be fundamental for you, right? And working on those with everything you have is absolutely imperative. Right, because those are the things that will make or break your organization for the next 5+ years, and I think being able to identify those and execute effectively is key. Right. I think one unrelated but funny anecdote is I'm not sure where I was traveling, but I had to take a train somewhere, and there was this key deployment that I had to do right before the train left. Right, and I was almost sure that I would not have access to phone, internet on the way. Right, so it was this super scary few hours when I was just hoping that things would not break, etc. But yeah, I mean, thankfully that went well. So do plan your deployments not around train or plane journeys. But yeah, I mean, I hope that's a semblance of a decent answer to your question.
That's awesome, man. Sitting and trying to deploy something train journey is awesome.
Yeah.
I think everyone here is sort of bursting to ask questions. So I'll wrap it up with the final one. Time kharab hai. Everybody's been talking about this whole funding winter. People are a little scared, I would say. What's your advice to an early stage founder just trying to make it? What do you have to say to them?
Yeah, that's something that I think we've seen talked about a lot. I think one broad macroeconomic takeaway is that cycles will always happen, right? whether it's a geopolitical situation, economic situation, or ship being stuck somewhere, right? There'll always be something or the cycles in the overall economy. I think one thing that is advantageous or slightly mitigates this issue, especially for early stage startups, is that you are the most immune, right? If you find a problem statement that you think is worth solving, you have a set of users whom you think it is worth solving for, there is often going to be funding available, and there's going to be a space for you to try and explore that. And on the flip side, if you don't build when you think it's the most opportune, you will end up losing out. In hindsight, I mean, we started Postman in 2014, right? My hunch is that if we started Postman maybe 2 years before that or 2 years after that, we would not have been where we are now, right? I think one interesting anecdote that I'll share, right? So in 2002, Jeff Bezos in Amazon, he issued this internal note to his engineering team, right, which is called the API mandate, right?
Very famous.
So it essentially said that all inter-team communication has to happen through APIs, no other means. And he ended it with everyone who is not going to follow this will be fired, right? And it took 14 years. I mean, it took 12 years from that point when one of the biggest engineering organizations in the world issued an internal note to reaching a state where something like Postman could reach the scale it has, right? So oftentimes in the technology world, developments will be fast, but long-term adoption and broad-based adoption will be slow, right? So it's important to weigh these two things and see what is the best moment for you to solve what you are trying to solve. I mean, we have seen numerous examples of companies and products that have failed because they were quote unquote too early for their time, or they were maybe solving the problem at a point where the right demand was absent. So especially for early stage founders, I would recommend maybe focusing on the problem statement and your users more. I think things like economic cycles will affect you once you start hitting a certain stage of growth. But if you're early stage, the only things that you should be concerned about are whom you're trying to solve for, what you're trying to solve, and what is the best way to solve that problem, right? And if I think those three questions are answered well enough, it's almost inevitable that obviously if you're able to find a business model that works, there is going to be enough funding, etc., available, enough hiring that you'll be able to do in order to scale effectively.
I think that's an amazing and super positive note to open up the founder questions. So I'll leave it to the Bits team to sort of allow the others to raise their hands, and then we'll just call you out and you can ask your question straight to Abhijit.
Okay, thanks a lot, Zaran. Thanks, Abhijit. So to all the founders that are in the meeting, you can virtually raise your hands, and Zaran will probably take, maybe recognize you, and then you can unmute and ask your question live to Abhijit during the session as well. So yeah, anyone can go first, anyone can raise their hands.
Okay, I see the first hand is up. Nishkash, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Zaran. Hello, Abhijit. It was a great talk, obviously. So we learned a lot. I loved your hustle story right before train. I remember when we were going to, we weren't able to, but when we were going to raise our pre-seed round with this investor, I was in the car and we were writing our application, and then we presented that to our investors. So that was funny. But coming back to what you said with respect to speaking with consumers, speaking with developers in your case specifically, and you said that some of the features obviously are still in your backlog, but you choose to ignore them for now. And then some features you take up on your own and just push them out. So could you give me a little more clarity on where that fine line is as to listening to users versus following your own intuition?
Yeah. Hope your investor pitch from the car went well. But I think the framework, if I were to sort of give you one, right, would be that you start because there's a core belief that you have that most others don't share, right? I mean, you share, your team shares, your investors share, your employees share. But yes, there will be some users who don't share that, right? I mean, we still have so many users saying, and this is especially true of software, right? Why does Dropbox exist? I can build this on my own in a weekend, right? So there'll always be, I think, users who are on the other side. I think if you're able to draw a clear path from the vision, which is essentially why your organization exists, if you're able to draw a clear path from there to what you are doing with the resources you have, you are, I think, moving towards a path where you will see the success that you were looking for, right? I think one thing that you'll see is that as you grow, there'll be a proliferation of your understanding of the problem space itself, right? For example, our own understanding of what APIs are has grown so much, right? Like there are types of APIs that people work on that are, super specific to the sort of hardware that you're doing, right? There's the entire world of IoT out there that we haven't even started looking at, right? And we hadn't even thought of these things when we started, right? So we do have developers who say, hey, is Postman doing anything for IoT? Is Postman doing anything for this one use case that I have? And at some point, I hope to be able to solve those use cases as well. But the way we operate now is, okay, every org is operating in a resource constrained environment. You have limitations on cost, team, hiring, etc. With those constraints, what's the most effective set of steps you can take to address the one vision that you have, right? And this mechanism of answering is necessarily going to be different for every org. But as long as you and the team can come up with a compelling story as to why you're doing what you're doing, it's fine, right? Because at the end of the day, there are more than one ways to achieve success, right? Now, as a founder, you don't have to just build features; you have to create a long-term organization, right? And for that, what's important is not only solving the short-term needs that you may see, but solving for the longer term. And that's something that oftentimes may mean sacrificing certain short-term requirements, but as long as you're able to weave a compelling story about short-term objectives, long-term vision, you should be good.
Understood. Thank you so much. So I think I will be very shameless here. I'll wait if anyone has any more questions. Otherwise, I'll hog the rest of our time.
Well, I'm just looking, and why don't you ask one more question?
Sure. So in terms of like when you are building the product, in terms of when you're like building features for Postman, obviously there are, so I think it was back in 2019 or 20 when I personally started seeing a proliferation of these API testing tools, these rapid API testing tools, interfaces, and all these things that came up.
Mm-hmm.
But for some reason, I obviously stuck with Postman still. How do you like define features that set your platform? So a better way to phrase it would be, what is your thought process when you see the competitive landscape out there, and then you decide ki, chalo, ye XYZ feature lete hain, that will set Postman apart and it will build a better experience. So in general, how do you think of like differentiating Postman from the rest of the landscape out there?
Got it. Yeah, that's a great and very, very pertinent question. I think it's one that we've had to address multiple times throughout our growth. I think one thing that has helped us is, even when we started, there was a whole bunch of API tooling out there, right? As I said, the API development landscape was very fragmented, right? There were different tools for API documentation, there were different tools for observability, different tools for security, etc. And yeah, one goal that we did have is that Postman should be simple to use, right? Like that's always one goal that we've had. In fact, the first hire that we did was not an engineer, but was someone to help us with UX, right? And one thing that we saw, for example, is that a lot of the other API tools that were out there were super hard to use, right? Now, they probably didn't start off being hard to use, but as they grew and as they started adding more and more capabilities, they got to a point where for a new user, it was like the hardest job just to learn how to use this new tool, right? And one of the goals that we had then, and we still have, is that onboarding is key, UX is key. We have to be able to optimize for our 80% user cohort, but we have to enable everybody, right? We have to enable the newest users who have not used Postman. Postman's long-term vision is to create 100 million developers in the world, right? And the 100 million number is not about how many users Postman has, but how many net new developers we are able to create, right? So one framing that I often use is that say 30 or 40 years ago, you had to have access to a university mainframe in order to program, right? Now that barrier has come down so much. And the reason Postman exists is what can we do to further that increase? What can we do to make it even easier for people with an idea to build what they want to build, right? And that, I think, is where the differentiation with other products starts from, right? Where we know that, okay, by adding these 5 features, okay, maybe we'll solve something for these 100 users. Is Postman going to become harder to use? Are other parts of Postman, the parts that we know are working, are they going to become harder to use? And if yes, that's probably something that we'll think very, very hard about, right? Especially in the space we are in, right? There's this huge proliferation of tools, but that is happening because the ecosystem itself is evolving, right? There's so many new protocols available, so many new methodologies available, right? Just Web 3.0, for example. I mean, everything that happened with blockchain, etc. So many new protocol standards were developed just for that, right? And it was a maybe 2-year cycle when all of that happened and stopped happening. Now we're seeing the same thing with AI, right? And obviously my hunch is that, and my hope is that this is a more long-term and fundamental change for the industry and the world in general. But there are so many new tools and standards coming out that one could say Postman should solve for, right? But if you feel strongly that maybe solving those would take away from the long-term vision that you have, it's probably something that would be good advice, because you're not going to be successful if you mix multiple philosophies, right? You started the org with one intent, and being able to do that or being able to achieve that intent well is the one thing that is going to lead to success for you, right? For a different org, they might have a slightly different philosophy, and they might be able to be successful in a slightly different way. But for us, for example, UX and onboarding was super important. We are always going to be solving for a new developer, maybe someone who has not learned programming before. What can we do to help them use APIs in order to build what they want to build? At the same time, we want to make sure that enterprises, even though they're not traditional software companies, right? We have a lot of clients who are maybe in the finance and insurance space, in the healthcare space, in the automotive space, who have this large and slightly disorganized API landscape. And we're looking to see how we can solve their problems, which a different tool may not be looking at, right? So we have our own set of problems and objectives, and that is going to lead to a certain way in which you sort of choose to build and choose to ignore, right? And yeah, I think the other way to think about this is that it's not a zero-sum game, right? There's enough for everyone, especially in this development space where there's an increasing number of people doing development every year. There's a huge space, and there are multiple super valuable problems to start solving, right? So just because you see that competitors are doing X, Y, and Z is not, I think, is not an automatic signal, because the one thing that I think has worked for us is focusing on our users, not our competitors, right? They'll always have different reasons, different philosophies, but we have a problem statement, we have some capabilities within our team, we have a set of users to solve for, and those are the only three things that make any difference in the end.
Abhijit, I have a question that I think we probably could have covered earlier, but I think it'd be very interesting now, is fundraising, right? You guys have had quite the journey. In fact, you guys are the anomaly where people were knocking at your door and not the other way around. So could you just educate us on your fundraising journey, how it went from 0 to 1?
Yeah, sure. So I think I'll start at the beginning, right? Where I think a few of our early conversations for our seed round, often went to a point where we felt that investors didn't align with our long-term vision, right? They wanted, excuse me, they wanted us to build towards maybe more enterprisey things almost immediately, right? And that's not where our heads were at. There were certain conversations that went into the existing product is good, the team is good, but why don't you start doing something completely different? And fortunately, those are not the investors that we went with. I think we've been incredibly fortunate to have a set of investors on board who believe in the short-term strategy as well as a long-term vision. But I think it was important to find an early investor that was 100% aligned, right? Because if there is even slight misalignment there, you'll find that the gap between what you want to build and what sort of external forces want you to build keeps increasing. And I think we've been extremely fortunate to not have that issue at all, right? As we scaled, I think we were fortunate to be, as you said, right, one step ahead of the curve, where even when we raised our seed round, there was some user adoption that we had. And I think that one fact has always helped us through our subsequent funding rounds as well. I think one important inflection point with regard to fundraising was when Abhinav moved to the US, which was, I think, in late 2015. And the reason we did that is that, we saw that in the development space, and at least this was true, back then, I'm sure it's changed a lot now, is that newer technologies were adopted in the US first, right? And there was a slight lag when it came to Indian enterprises, at least. I mean, students or developers would be different, but Indian enterprises, at least adopting that, there was a slight lag that we were observing. And then there was also this slight bias that we had to overcome. It was seen somewhat in some investors we spoke to. It was seen a lot in prospective hiring as well, which was I didn't know a global product could be built from India, right? Some interesting conversations that we've had with families of employees is that, oh, why do you want to work in the Indian Postal Department, right? So I think we had some of those types of things to overcome. And as we grew, beyond our seed and Series A, we were able to find, sets of investors who we knew could help us in the sort of growth that we wanted to build, right? So internally, for example, we have this enterprise product track and we have this developer product track, and they both have slightly differing objectives, right? Like on one side, you're trying to be the de facto API platform for all enterprises out there, where 15 years ago, it was every company is a software company. Now it's every company is an API company. And what can we do to get into that enterprise segment, learn how enterprise software proliferation and procurement works, make sure that we are able to set up our sales and marketing functions appropriately. And yeah, we have been, as I said, fortunate to have investors who have helped us every step of the way. On the developer side, we need to make sure that we are at the forefront of the leading technical developments in the API space, right? The way the latest types of collaboration is happening, the way the latest types of API standards are being adopted. Postman needs to have a voice there as well, right? Because there are often examples where in the technology space that small things can have huge impacts, right? We've all read about how Blockbuster was completely made irrelevant because they failed to adopt this one new technology that existed, right? So we want to make sure that those things don't happen, and the types of investors you choose sort of help you make sure that you are investing in those appropriate areas, right? We have to invest in the enterprise. We have to invest on the forefront of whatever development is happening. And yeah, I think the one story that we've been able to keep constant is that drawing from our vision of 100 million developers, how that translates into what we want for enterprise, how that translates into what we want for newer developers that we are onboarding. And obviously all of that is helped by the fact that we've been able to do that fairly efficiently, keeping burn low, keeping our efficiency of operation high. And that's always something that attracts investors. When we do have obviously a lot of examples where the opposite is true. So I think, yeah, just keeping those things in mind, that it's a long-term company that you want to run. For that, efficiency is key. For that, thinking long-term is key. And the right investors will automatically be drawn to those sorts of thought processes.
It can be summarized to solve the problem so well that they knock on your door.
Absolutely.
I think we have time for one or two questions more. I see Sarthak has raised his hand. Sarthak, over to you.
Hi, Abhijit. Great session so far. Interesting to hear about your journey. I am Sarthak. I'm not a startup founder, not yet actually, at least. I am a student at BITS Pilani, part of the Conquest team. and I'm currently on my PS1 actually.
Oh, got it.
Right. So my question here is, you said you sort of started full time actually building Postman with Abhinav while you're still working at Walmart Labs at that time, right?
Yeah.
So my question is, what made you so confident in what you were building at that point in time that you went all in? Right? What was that moment where you thought that, yes, this is something I want to do full time, and I believe in this product so much that I can take the leap?
Yeah, I mean, I would be mistaken if I said there was a single moment that helped me believe that. So the actual way our interaction started is while I was still at Walmart, I was working on some of the open source components that we had, and I think the one thing that helped me formally make that transition is that I enjoyed the sense of ownership that I had, which I did not have in my existing role. Right now, obviously, all of that was compounded by the fact that I'd worked with Abhinav before. The problem statement itself seemed highly compelling and promising for the long term. But if all of those things had been there and I did not have a sense of ownership that I immediately felt, it's probably not something that I would have started. So yeah, I think those were the things, and the fact that even when I spoke to my circle of friends who were working in a similar space, a lot of them knew what Postman was. They were excited by it. That also helped give some sort of social validation to what you were building. And I think all of those were super important ingredients for me. If any one of them had been absent, it would probably not have been something that I did. I think the one other thing that I'll add there, right, is that the one thing that I enjoyed, prior to formally starting, and even in our first few years of operation, is that simple excitement of seeing something that you have built be shipped out and seeing actual users who you haven't spoken to earlier say that, hey, this helps me, right? I think that cycle, the more you can make it happen, the faster you can spin that user feedback flywheel, the faster you will build up your own motivation, right? The fact that we were able to ship fast, we were able to solve real user problems with each iteration, that gives you a sense of excitement that a different role probably would not be able to give you. So I think, yeah, that was the one thing that really helped.
Got it. Fantastic from that. Thank you.
Perfect. I think that is all we have time for. Abhijit, where can founders, what socials can founders follow you on? Are you on Twitter? Are you on LinkedIn?
I'm a pure consumer on all of these forums. I think I have a total of 15 tweets in my life. But yeah, I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter, so you can find me there. And obviously happy to engage with anyone who has questions there.
Perfect. There you go. So now you know if you have other burning questions, where to find Abhijit. Abhijit, I think gratitude to you, man, taking your time on a Saturday and spending about 75 minutes with us, just walking us through the journey. Really appreciated it. Some really cool insights. Loved the train hustle story. And yeah, I'm sure everyone's charged up to solve their problems for the users thanks to this conversation.
Yeah, happy to help. It was a great conversation. I think it always helps sort of rethinking how you've made certain key decisions early on. And thanks for all the excellent questions that you and all the other participants had.
Cheers. Bits team, over to you.
Yeah, perfect. I think that was an incredible session. Abhijit, thank you so much for taking out the time. Thank you so much for coming here and bringing all these wonderful insights to our founders. It's been incredible to sort of see your journey. As personally as a Bitsian, I think Postman has been an example that a lot of us have seen at college of of the startup dream that a lot of us want to pursue. So from the Conquest team as well, a huge thanks to you. And yeah, I think that's all we have for the session today. Thanks everyone for tuning in. You know where to find Abhijit now. He's given you his socials. Feel free to drop into his DMs with any questions that you might have at any point. But yeah, thanks a lot, Abhijit. Thanks a lot, Zaran, for joining in. Thanks a lot for the great session.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.